and move on to the next session. So if I could ask Fabio Casiroli to join me up at the top. Now, we are shifting in many ways territory at the moment from the discussion of and the presentation of two urban conditions in very different national and political contexts. We're now moving to two presentations which are really talking about ways of looking at the city in a more generic way. And one is from someone who, you might not believe it when he speaks, is a transport planner. And the other one, Tim Stoner, who will follow him, who, together with Professor Bill Hillier at the University College London, has developed a methodology of describing the public space network of the city and how that relates, this sort of DNA of the city relates to the way pedestrians in particular actually use, or in some cases abuse, the system of the city. So I'm going to ask Fabio to start. Fabio, as I say, is a transport planner from Milan, from Italy. He's a professor at the Polytechnic of Milan. He runs a practice called Sistematica, which has been involved in some of the major projects around the world, working closely with Norman Foster, Richard Rogers, and many others, and a fellow traveler. And Renzo Piano, sorry, we mustn't forget our Italian friends. Has been a fellow traveler with us in the urban age and will now present some of the work which is quite controversial in looking at the city as a system, not as a static system of movement, but as a dynamic system of movement which takes into account time as well as space. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Do you think it's possible to turn just a little bit down the lights on the screen? Thank you. Good afternoon. Traditionally, Milan is conceived as an industrial and grey city. The reality, instead, is very different. Milan, 1.2 million inhabitants, is a rich financial capital with a typical Italian historical city center, including a large amount of magnificent historical monuments. But its greater metropolitan area, 4.5 million inhabitants, is dispersed, similar to Los Angeles or Detroit, and the car ownership mounts up to about 700 vehicles per 1,000 inhabitants. 20 years from the end of the Second World War, this was the situation of the urban settlements in the Milan metropolitan area and northern city. You can see Milan, Turin, and the number of historical cities, each with a population that ranges between 1 to 300,000 inhabitants. Looking at the 2005 map, the uncontrolled sprawl is evident. Assuming the existing trends, the forecasts are really dramatic, as you can see in this picture. The exercise I did with my students was to see what will happen if the planning had reinforced the historical town located at 40 to 50 kilometers from Milan, imposing at the same time radical restrictions to the growth of small villages. This was possible using the radial and orbital railway networks that already exist around Milan. The result is clear. Control of settlement growth and skillful enhancement of the rail network would have avoided the sprawl and allowed for the containment of congestion and pollution, a big problem for this macro region today. The resident population is exactly the same, but the land exploited is absolutely less. In poor countries, lack of planning means forced people to live in desperate social conditions. And the time spent for traveling is a quality indicator for poor as well as rich cities. Can town and transport planners use different keys to read inequalities and social exclusion? I think so. And I believe that the functional urban shapes are changeable, depending on the mode of transport used and on the hour of the day. I believe that the non-material dimension, time, is the right key to read the functional urban form today. This is Milan at 8 a.m. on a weekday. The yellow area shows the size of the city based on the number of people who can get to the city core by car within 45 minutes. 2.2 million people live in this area. At the same time of the day, public transport allows for an important expansion of the covered area, particularly along rail lines, in spite of the fact that transport services are deemed inadequate. 4.1 million people live there. If we look at the sports city, everything changes. Imagine we have to reach the soccer stadium on Saturday evening. The road network is no longer congested, and the area that is accessible within 45 minutes by car expands. 4.3 million inhabitants live in this area. On the other side, the lack of public transport means that the journey back home is quite impossible, and Milan contracts dramatically, hosting less than 1/10 of the amount of people as before. Now, the metropolis is a village. Different times of day, different mode of transport, different city shapes. Milan still remains the same, but its functional shape changes, never coinciding with its own administrative boundaries. Istanbul is highly dependent on cars, group taxis, and buses. 94% of daily journeys take place on the road network with negative effects on congestion, environment, and accessibility. Looking at the mobility footprints, it's easy to see how difficult it is to reach by public transport Kadikoy, the most popular leisure place, compared to accessibility by car, in spite of the traffic jams. The numbers show the population living inside the areas accessible in 45 minutes or less. Despite its huge dimension, Tokyo is a virtuous example. An incredibly widespread public transport network, active 24 hours a day, efficient and well-connected, is able to offer a powerful accessibility to residents, city users, and tourists. Looking at the mobility maps, it's possible to appreciate the different functional forms of Tokyo. The accessibility to the Imperial Palace by public transport is wider than the accessibility by car. Los Angeles, by definition the city of the car, has a disastrous modal split. 80% of the journeys are made by car, 20% with other modes, including only 7% by public transport. You can see also the pollution. Looking at the accessibility maps, it's easy to see the difference between the huge city of the car and the compressed city of the public transport, particularly during off-peak hours. The yellow color defines the area that is accessible to Rodeo Drive in 45 minutes or less by car and by public transport. In Los Angeles, if you don't have a car, you are socially excluded. In Sao Paulo, each day, 12 million journeys are made on foot, 12 million by public transport, and 12 million by car. Many journeys last more than 2 hours in each direction. The accessibility maps to the city core in a weekday AM peak hour show the percentage of inhabitants living inside a 45-minute area by car and by public transport. A comparison with London in white shows the difference between the two cities, one with a poor and the other with efficient networks. The majority of New Yorkers commute to work or to school by train, underground, or bus. Looking at the rush hour of a working day, we can see the different footprints from Columbia University and the people living less than 45 minutes, 3.5 million by car, and 5.8 million by public transport. The engineering approach to mobility makes use of models more or less complex. My philosophical approach is quite different. As a town and transport planner, I believe that the city's mobility DNA is dynamic and cultural and not static and technical. Many cities have realized that the money allocated to public transport is not an expenditure, but an investment. These examples show metros, bus rapid transit, tramways, and regional trains in some cities around the world. Unfortunately, these modes of transport are not enough to convince many people to leave their cars in the garage. When we have to move inside the town, our dream is to be able to find a mode of transport that is near home, clean, comfortable, cheap, and that allows to reach quickly our destination. The reality is quite different. If we use our car, we are immediately merged in traffic stream, and when we get near the destination, a stressful search of a parking place begins. If we decide to use public transport, we discover that the stops are often far away and sometimes unreachable. Then we understand that the problem is to cover the first and the last mile, and that is necessary to combine the concept of public transport with an individual micro-mobility system. The dream for all is born. Hundreds of eco-stations populated by bicycles and very small electric cars for rent to begin or to end the journey, ideally with the same ticket used on the train, metro, tram, or bus. We are talking about the real alternative to cars. Micromobility expands the accessible area, supports the multipolar city, offers opportunities capable of regenerating the outskirts, and confirms the theory that the key to read the urban mobility is not distance, but time. I would like to conclude my speech with some examples showing the effect of micromobility in selected global cities. Rome, in 15 minutes on foot and by macromobility. Milan, where I selected some peripheral metro stations to stress the potentiality of micromobility, including the outskirts in the urban body. Singapore, where the first map shows the area accessible in 15 minutes on foot from the stations of the main transport systems, say underground and monorail. Accessibility in 15 minutes using micromobility shows a city of a different order of magnitude. This is Dubai and Abu Dhabi, both in the Emirates. Piccadilly line in London, a single example taken from one of the most popular and well-connected networks in the world. Metro line 9 in Paris, and line C in New York. I am not a dreamer. Investing resources in the right place, cities of the third millennium will be able to offer better mobility to all, reducing inequalities and social exclusion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Given the title of today's event, I want to turn the subject closer to the word design and to address the role of architects in the design of our future mobility. And I want to make the argument that cities need architects to design them, not just for the buildings that have to fit into them, but for the networks of space that organize the way that cities move, and especially for the design of the patterns of transaction that occur on those streets. And for me, mobility is important, but I want to offer an argument that it isn't everything. And cities are nothing if they're only mobility. What they must also be is transaction. That is the coming together of people in space to trade. Economically, yes, but also socially. And this concept of social trade, I want to argue, is the essence of why we choose to be in cities in the first place. But before architects can really be helpful, I think we need to get cities better than we presently do. There's a problem in our education about cities, that many architects simply aren't taught more than what they see on the surface. And as a result of that, we often make mistakes. I've lost a slide, so let me just summarize, as it's disappeared, what you would have seen and heard or read. What is it that architects should be designing for in cities? I want to say there are three things. First, the layout, the streets and the paths, but also the layout of the land use assets. So what goes where as an asset? And then how is it all connected through the routes? Then we need to design the movement machine, the way in which those assets attract people through those routes to create opportunities to move. And then finally, we need to design the transaction engine, which generates and accommodates the social and economic exchange, and ultimately the cultural identity of the places that we create. And a city is therefore a place both of production of our industries, but also reproduction and evolution of our cultures. All of this needs designing. When cities don't work, there's a problem that a whole series of assumptions are let loose. into the policy framework. And perhaps the greatest and most damaging of these assumptions is that failing cities lack transport infrastructure. Witness Sydney, Australia, and the aerial people mover. Was that really a solution to a failing downtown in Sydney? Or even the radical and rather crude plumbing of highway arteries into the fine capillary network of historic cities here in the States and obviously also in Europe. Transport was seen as the solution. But as you can see here from this slide of the center of Beijing, transport often only exacerbates the problem. So it's not just about transport or engineering. As Jean-Paul Sartre remarked, like engineering, everything has been figured out except how to live. We can move people to the moon and back, but really is that an advancement alone of our culture that's needed? And we keep seeing this. I mean, witness in this country the federal response to the economic recession in the road building projects that were identified, the shovel-ready projects to make and fix US cities. So I want to argue that to fulfill those three roles I set out earlier of layout and movement and transaction, we need to provide a new kind of mobility. And so, unlike what Enrique Peñalosa said, I don't think the problem is only one of government. I think it's also a problem of designing the right kind of mobility. And that's a problem of design theory. And there's a role for architects in this. But there's a problem. For various reasons, architects haven't got cities beyond an obsession with surface, with what you see on the building in the city. Here's a recent example from the centre of London. I'll come back to it later on to try and make my argument as to why this isn't enough. It's not enough just to focus on the aesthetic, however important that is. It's not enough to focus on the skyline. We also need to focus on the street line. Now, why should architects have failed to get it? Well, I think we inherited a problem from the perils of taxonomy of the 19th century, dividing objects of study into convenient boxes on the left in the natural sciences and on the right in terms of our professional disciplines today. We've pocketed ourselves separately and the knowledge hasn't flowed between our professions. And as a result of that, architects have focused on what things look like, and they focused on the buildings and not how the places work between. Working between is seen to be a lower order a responsibility of the engineer, and when that comes to cities, that means the traffic engineer. Again, lost words. Perhaps looking at a blank screen is more interesting than looking at words. But what is it that architects should be designing? And why is it architects? Well, it doesn't have to just be architects. One thing that architects, I think, do especially well, though, is to resolve complex problems into elegant solutions. And I think there's probably no greater complex problem than the city. And this is what I wish more of the talent of architects, where this creative ability is found in greater levels. I wish more of that talent were directed. Let's just move on to another disappearing slide. This is wonderful. It's making my presentation all the shorter because it gets me to the meat of the presentation, which is to study the city, you need to know how to look at it and describe it. And my research colleagues at University College London and now in various places around the world, and I, over many years, have been studying how cities work and focusing on the role of space. And when you put space as a subject of study at the heart of the different professions, give everybody a common ground to think about, the knowledge starts to flow between them. Here's a plan of the city of Munich in Germany, where, as many of you may have seen before, the technique of just drawing all the space in black is a very useful one to focus on the places in which those transactions occur. You can go one step further. Draw not only the fluid public realm, but break it into discrete elements of lines in this case. These are lines of sight, the longest and fewest lines that pass through all of the city and create a network. And then using mathematics, which I'm not going to go into today, we can measure properties of that network, properties of the geometry, connectedness being an absolutely crucial one of them, where here the hotter red lines represent the most mathematically connected routes. Then the orange, the yellow, the green, and to the blue ones, which have fewer connections. And this mathematical connectivity, we've discovered, has some amazing properties in cities, properties that tell us about how cities work and tell us ultimately about those transactions. I'm summarizing 40 years of research in 10 slides, so forgive me. But we can start looking at the spatial mathematics of the city. Here, London, where if they'd come through, the red lines go from the center to the edge. Perhaps you can see them better than I can. Perhaps you can't. It's terrifically clear here on the screen. And give London a very particular radial structure that focuses its energy very much to the center of the city, but leaves some of that energy on the radials that become the local high streets of London. Compare that with the plan of Beijing, which doesn't have the strong radials of London, but does have strong orbital routes in Beijing's famous rings. It's a different pattern with a different geometrical property. And Tokyo, having both strong radials and strong orbitals, and Tokyo known for its many important centers. It doesn't just have one important center like London's West End city, but it has many. And the argument I want to make is that this is directly related to the geometry of the city, to the connectedness, spreading more evenly the connections across the whole of the city. And every city, therefore, has a unique spatial signature, an urban DNA, which is scientifically measurable spatially. So what? Well, it turns out that most of this has disappeared. It turns out that when you measure these properties, as here in Berlin, where we measure the connectivity of everything to everything, and it focuses on the center, so that might be how long-distance journeys are moving across Germany's capital, intensifying the center, leaving the edges relatively disconnected in terms of vehicle movement. Or we can measure the pedestrian movement at a smaller scale, tuning the connectivity to look at local properties of the street network, and you then pick out some of the local culturally important centers of the city center. It turns out that these levels of connectivity also correspond to levels of traffic movement, traffic of pedestrians, traffic of bikes, traffic of vehicles. It turns out remarkably that analyzing only this one property of connectivity explains between 60 to 80% of the volumes of movement in the city. This is an extremely light form of traffic engineering modeling, if you like, which makes it very useful when it comes to the process of design, because it means that we can analyze and then change that network very quickly and look at the differences. But it's not just about the layout, it's not just about the movement, it's about the third thing that I mentioned earlier, the transactive capacity, if you like, of the street itself, which is important. And what do I mean by transactive capacity? Well, compare Paris on the left and the city of Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, on the right. These are two of the most culturally significant streets in the world, the Champs-Élysées on the left and the road to the holy city of Medina on the right. Yet, clearly different urban conditions. So it's not enough just to get the connections right. There are design principles to release the transactive capacity of the city that need to be understood. The first one of them is buildings need to face the street. This should sound obvious. It's obvious to most architects I meet. I meet many architects and I work in many different places with many architects who are famous and less famous. But not all of them do this. Real estate value is enhanced when buildings face the street. Secondly, and obviously it's not showing, Buildings need to have active bases. The street line is critical. When buildings meet the ground, they are engaging with the city. And if they turn themselves away and become blank, they diminish the transactive potential of being there in the first place. This is a real diminution of asset value. Third, the route network itself should be simple. By that I mean generally linear. Not necessarily a grid, but generally linear. Whether we like it or not, human beings move in lines most of the time. We find the path of least resistance from our origin to our destination. And we don't wander, meander aimlessly as we move purposefully through cities. Even though that's what I was taught as an architect, funnily enough, that it's the interesting winding journeys we have to design for. Bad theory pervades in schools of architecture, even to this day, and I was educated a long time ago. Another absolutely critical one, urban areas need a critical mass of continuous connected routes. What does that mean? Well, you need big lumps of urbanism to get a city working. You need a grid to be broad and not fragmented. And this is the point where I want to mention a concern I have about landscape urbanism, which is an emerging and growing line of urban planning, especially here in the United States, which is introducing, for very good reasons, green parks into the city. But many of the examples that I see fragment the urbanism into little blocks, separated by parks. And I have great worries about this because you only have to turn to this great city we're in to see a different form of landscape urbanism where the large parks are the exceptions and the smaller parks are the norm. And then the grid runs connected and continuous in between, enhancing the transactive capacity. Back to the building I showed earlier, and I'm not going to name names, but what buildings and routes must also do is let you see not only objects and destinations in the distance, but also the means of achieving your route to them. There's no clue as to how you change levels in this view here. And it's hardly surprising that even though this has just been built right in the middle of the city of London, it was empty when I was there the other day, and it's been empty when my colleagues have visited it before and since. This is amazing to actually have created an empty space where activity is so intense around. This is the most effective form of keeping a presentation short, because really we're missing a case study that I wanted to show that was a use of what I've just shown you in Trafalgar Square in London. Maybe we can do that afterwards. Come and see me and I'll show you the slides on the machine, where we worked with Norman Foster to turn a public space that was previously mostly empty most of the time, the heart of London, into what is now a vibrant public space used 13 times by Londoners by volume of what it was before, by inserting a staircase into the space to create exactly what was missing from that previous slide of a continuous visible route from one level of the square to the next, and in doing so making it easy for Londoners to just use that square as a place to pass through and not only to go to. And another point I wanted to make in the slide sequence is this relationship between the movement through and the movement to a place is critical. If you separate through movement from to movement, as happened in many of the public housing projects, both here and where I'm more familiar with in Europe, in the last 50 years, where we turned developments inwards, we made it easier to walk around them than through them, you lose life itself. You lose the transactive capacity of the place. It's important to have strangers on your street is another way of summarizing what I'm saying. And being brought up with the epithet stranger equals danger is very dangerous in itself. It turns out strangers are incredibly important for our safety, to give the street the sense of well-being. So in practice, I live in two places between the world of academia and the world of practice, and in particular between UCL's Space Syntax Laboratory, which has been running for 40 years, and my consulting company at the bottom. And what passes between us are the people, the ideas, and the questions that keep an active conversation going between the world of fundamental research and the world of everyday practice. And I call this at the top here a process of mutual exploitation. I think it's the most important thing to happen with universities, is to make them face outwards to the world of practice, as well as, importantly, looking inwards. Here we go again. So, one of the most significant applications of these tools at the moment is in the unplanned settlements of the globalizing cities, and much of my time is spent in unplanned informal settlements. As an architect, redesigning some of those settlements that have grown up in isolation from the city. The two images you're looking at here are, on the left, an analysis of the local connectivity of Jeddah's slums. In fact, it's analysing the local walkability of the whole of Jeddah, but the hotspots it's bringing out are really the only places in the city where walkability is possible because of the fine-grained, multiply connected street grid. It turns out these are all the slums, which, although I'm using the official word that's used in the city, are by no means places devoid of life. They're some of the most wonderfully exciting and convivial parts of the city. Yet on the right, when we look at the way cars use the city at the large scale, those slums hardly appear at all. They're backgrounded in blue. A spatial imbalance is occurring in this city, whereby you have two kinds of life, the life of the walkable slum and the life of the drivable, wealthier city. And this creates economic tension that separates the slum from the rest of the city and makes it very difficult for people living in the slum to trade off the city around them. And so through design, we've been working with the layout, in this case, one of the slums highlighted in grey, with the wealthier city around it, to draw, tease through routes that connect centre to edge, that don't drive great roads through the slum, as Haussmann did in Paris, but instead work more organically to connect those contiguous settlements of differences in wealth, and create around the edge of the slum especially a place of higher intensive commercial activity that gives slum dwellers an opportunity to have economic existence alongside their residential existence. And I think, especially having seen the presentation from South Africa, this absence of local economy in unplanned informal settlements, or even planned low-income settlements, is a great risk for urbanity. You can't just provide houses, you need to provide jobs. And we're looking here at an image that shows the more intense routes in red and orange, and then the background in blue, quieter streets for people to live in, so that we can work with the economic requirements for development, but put the land uses where the more connected streets, the busier streets are going to be, and plan naturally, if you like, with the layout of the city. Make the taller buildings, create a spatial code where taller buildings are located on more accessible routes. So to close, I just want to mention one aspect of the city which is emerging so quickly that we need to think about it, and this is perhaps where this conversation can help me, which is the world online, the city online as a phenomenon. Cities on land create networks of connectivity that allow us to transact face-to-face, but equally, communities online provide networks of connectivity that allow us equally to communicate and increasingly to communicate. And I've been spending much of my time in my fellowship at Harvard looking into the world online and learning actually that the way it's being discussed and described uses most of the urban words that we've heard this morning: network, connectivity, capacity. And there is a great learning opportunity that I wish I knew more about, but I'm focusing my studies on at the moment, to make sure that we can bring some of what we've learned about cities at work to the world online. Let me give you one example: search, the way that we find things in cities. is so often serendipitous. Walking along the street, you're there for a reason, but something else happens that you hadn't quite realized. Speaking to colleagues at Harvard, I'm understanding that this is also one of the desires for design online, is how you can make things happen that you didn't really expect people to be there for. Now, clearly with Facebook and Twitter, that's already beginning to emerge, but it's a big subject of discussion for people who design places online. And I think there's equally a role for planners and architects and engineers to share our worlds, because after all, it's the people transacting that are the common denominator between online and on land. And increasingly, we are really ambivalent often as to whether we would be online or on land to do so. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you for doing that with half the slides missing. What I suggest is that we hold this and so that we can catch up. There are a number of big questions that I would like to bring up, but we'll do it at the end with the panel so that we can catch up, have 10-minute, 5-7-minute coffee, and then come back. But certainly the two big issues hanging in the air, which we will return to, is one is how to describe the city. And we've seen two very different ways of describing the mobility DNA, the spatial DNA, and then of course how do you intervene in that and get it right, which is another problem without being normative about it. But can I ask you to have coffee and come back and by 3:30 so we can have the final session? Thank you very much.